Hello, and welcome to the 8th chapter of our Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe read-through. I'm Jem, the reader at St John the Baptist Parish Church in Beeston, and the chapter we're going to be looking at today is What Happened After Dinner. So if you haven't already read the chapter, do so by all means. It begins, "And now," said Lucy, "do please tell us what's happened to Mr. Tumnus." And it ends, "You're right, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband. "We must all get away from here. There's not a moment to lose." As with previous episodes, I'll be picking up on things that struck me or made me pause in the chapter, perhaps rather piecemeal rather than working through every line or every page of it. But Lewis's work, as we've said before, I think repays rereading, that there are things that seem obvious and things that seem obscure, and those aren't always the same things to the same people, or they aren't always the same things in the same read-through. So what struck me this time? There are some growing hints as to Aslan's identity, or perhaps I'd better say that there's a growing building of Aslan's identity here. We hear that Peter has a plan, or is trying to forge a plan to save Tumnus, who's been taken away to the witch's house. And he says, we could dress up as peddlers, or couldn't we perhaps storm the castle? Mr. Beaver says, "It's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good you're trying, of all people. But now that Aslan is on the move," and it's interesting, it makes it clear that Peter, on his own, and indeed the children on their own with stratagems, aren't going to be able to do what needs to be done here. There's a sense that Aslan is something more than just an extremely powerful person. We had in a previous episode the Lewisian trilemma, in which Lewis absolutely forbids people to think that Jesus was nothing but a great and wise human being. And here we again seem to have a sense that Aslan's power is not like human power, magnified to the nth degree, or indeed to the nth power. It's a different kind of thing, and it's a mistake to class him as just another agent in the world, but a particularly powerful one. And the same impression is given when Aslan's name is mentioned. "Oh yes, tell us about Aslan," said several voices at once, for once again that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like good news, had come over them. And we get that echo again of the Philippians passage, that at the name of Aslan, things happen, just as at the name of Jesus, things are drawn out of people. They have responses to it, as Paul writes. The question of what's happened to Mr. Tumnus is gone into a bit more in this chapter. And I'd like to pause on that as well, because the witch obviously turns people into stone. We've already heard this, and we'll later see it more dramatically, perhaps, when Edmund goes to the witch's castle. But I'd like to pause on the symbolism of and what it might represent. So what the witch tends to do is turn people into stone, a punishment or a form of aggression which seems very similar to what she does to Narnia as a whole. So when people are turned to stone, they become cold, they become frozen, they become locked in the moment of what they were doing at the particular time, and they become objects rather than people. Now, the medieval worldview that Lewis expounds so dramatically in The Discarded Image contains the idea that humans have three kinds of soul. They have the rational soul, and recall how important rationality is to the professor and to Lewis. They have the animal soul, that can move about, that responds like an animal to things, and they have the vegetable soul that contains growth and can respond to light and things like that. Things like stone don't have any soul at all. So when you make someone into stone in this world, you are removing who they are. You're making them into a shell of themselves. They have the appearance of a human, but they don't have the essence of a human. It's pared away at who they are. And that's a powerful image religiously. It's been an image that particularly Puritan evangelicals have used of the hardness and calcification of religious practice when it simply becomes an empty ritual, an empty rite. But it's also an image of the opposite of what Aslan does. Aslan, of course, as we will later see, undoes this, brings people from stone to life, puts breath and puts liveliness back into them. It's striking that the form of attack that the witch has on people is to turn them into hard, meaningless form, things that look like people but aren't really people. I witness how shrewd Mr. Beaver is when he talks about if you ever meet something that is going to be human but isn't human yet, or should be human and isn't human, or was human and isn't human anymore, you keep your eyes on it and reach for your hatchet. Whereas what Aslan does is make people more themselves. He enables them to not simply be the outward forms of things, but the things that they are themselves. That's a rather roundabout way of saying it, but I was particularly struck on this read through as to what it is that the witch does, and that we can see this on a macro level, that she makes people in her country literally frozen in time, but also less themselves because they're worried about trees overhearing them or the secret police getting to them. They have less opportunity to express themselves and their nature. And we have these lovely bits of poetry which go to explain some more of who Aslan is, though again obliquely and obscurely perhaps. No, he'll put all to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. And then he mentions later, that's another of the old rhymes. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bones sit at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. And Lewis, like Tolkien, had a great love for the medieval literatures and the myths and legends of both northern and southern Europe. And these passages remind me of snatches of medieval poetry like the anonymous Adam lay bounden or I sing of a maiden, even down to the slight half rhymes, which may be simply because we pronounce words differently. So it summons up verses like this for me. Adam lay bounden, bounden in a bond, 4,000 winter thought he not too long, and all was for an apple that he took, as clerkers find written in their book. Ne had the apple taken been, ne had never Our Lady a been Heavena's queen. Blessed be the time that apple taken was, therefore may we singen Deo gratias. Or I sing of a maiden. I sing of a maiden that is matchless, king of all kings to her son Chechis. He came also still, there his mother was, as dew in April that falleth on the grass. He came also still to his mother's bower, as dew in April that falleth on the flower. He came also still, there his mother lay, as dew in April that falleth on the spray. Mother and maiden, never none but she, well may switch a lady, goddess mother be. And just as I was reminded of those verses with the sort of the lilt and the half rhymes, and I looked them up, of course, they're extremely appropriate for this point in the story. They're carols, and they're about the birth of Christ, but they're also about the setting free of Adam from the shackles, the bonds that had lasted 4,000 winter. Now, obviously, I can't say that Lewis was thinking of that passage or that carol when he was writing this book. But it only goes to show, I think, that the imagery that finds its way into the literal detail of the fantastical world here has such a long tradition in not only theology, but the hymns and the poetry and the common currency of medieval English Christianity. So yes, when we get onto the identity of Aslan, it says that he is a lion. He's not a man. He's potentially, I don't know, threatening, scary. I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion, said Susan. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most, or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point. And this is a very famous passage, of course. It's a passage that is bandied around an awful lot by people who quote Lewis in popular discussions of Christianity. I'm not going to suggest that they're wrong for doing that, but it is often, I think, used to emphasize the judgmental side of Christianity, perhaps, or certainly the imposing and threatening elements of Christianity. Indeed, he's not a tame lion has become something of a meme or something of an eye-rolling reference amongst perhaps the more liberal or progressive thinkers in Christianity. And I think it's worth thinking about what what it represents here. There are two ways, perhaps, of thinking about it. First of all, that it represents transcendence. After all, the incarnation as an idea contains both an extremely immanent concept, the idea of Emmanuel, God with us, the full humanity, the true humanity of Jesus, which Orthodox Christianity has always stressed, and also the transcendence, the utter strangeness, the other apartness, the holiness in the literal sense of apartness of God, and that Jesus was fully divine. And I think the lionness, if you like, of Jesus, which is strange and apart and scary and doesn't sort of make sense to the children, is a way of thinking about that transcendence. Another way of thinking about it, which perhaps isn't as distinct as it might be, is an idea that Rowan Williams has written about in The Lion's World, that both the talking beast generally and Aslan's being a lion are confrontations for the reader with the idea of otherness, that there is enormous solidarity, enormous goodness, and enormous generousness in Aslan, but that we shouldn't always expect solidarity and salvation to look comfortably like us. And indeed, this is one of the challenges of Christian faith, to look beyond things that seem comfortably like us and similar to us, and not use ourself as the measure of the world or the form into which the world should fit. I talked at the beginning of these episodes, didn't I, about the way in which Lucy seems to find her identity questioned as soon as she goes into Narnia, rather than simply discovering things about the magical world she's in. And I wonder whether the strangeness and otherness of the Saviour being a lion, being a beast, is part of that it calls our security and our identity as the centre ontologically of the world into question. Again, just a speculation. Now, as we learn a bit more about Aslan, we also learn a bit more from the White Witch. "That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver," said Peter. "I mean, isn't the witch herself human?" "She'd like us to believe it," said Mr. Beaver, "and it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes of your father Adam's," here Mr. Beaver bowed, "your father Adam's first wife, her they call Lilith, and she was one of the Jinn. That's what she comes of down one side, and the other side she comes of the giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in the witch." This is perhaps a slightly strange thing to drop in a children's story. After all, Lilith is perhaps not a common name bandied around in the nursery and in fairy tales. Lilith, according to legend, is, as he says, the first wife of Adam. She's often represented as a spirit that flies by night, that feeds on the blood of young men, generally an all-round rotter. She's also been recuperated and rehabilitated imaginatively by various creative writers in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, as rather like Gothic scholars go into vampires and other supernatural novels and look to recuperate images of the supposedly bad woman, the woman who transgresses. There have been various creative writers who've looked at Lilith and thought, she's the lively side, the transgressive side, the dangerous side. She's everything that was taken away to make the meek and mild image of Eve, which has often been transmitted. However, I think there's a particular reason for the lineage of the witch appearing at this point, because one of Lewis's great influences in fantasy writing was George MacDonald, the Scottish minister and writer who was a Christian Universalist and something of a pioneer in the writing of what we would now call fantasy fiction. He wrote novels like, short novels like The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie. He also wrote one called Lilith, whose plot focuses around people who are asleep, and the figure of Lilith, who is the queen of a country against which the heroes have to make war, and she is dazzling and beautiful, but just about fails to take the hero with her charms, though she comes near to it, and then she's vanquished in the end. And I think there are obvious similarities there, and this image of Lilith obviously stayed in Lewis's imagination and found its way into this novel. I don't know whether it's an inside joke. I don't know whether he's saying, just as the White Witch is a descendant of Lilith, my book is a descendant of George MacDonald's book. It could be literally he's saying, and you could almost write a fanfic here where he's inserting his wicked queen into the lineage of George MacDonald's Wicked Queen, or whether he's simply taking a sort of nod to the master, as it were. But I think there's definitely a connection here between the fact that one of his major influences wrote a book about someone called Lilith. So those are the things that struck me reading through this chapter. Looking back, I think they might have been a bit more piecemeal and a bit more random than usual. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. So please do leave some reactions in the comments. What are the things that sprang to your mind when you read this chapter? And you're very welcome to tell me where I'm wrong on the things that sprang to my mind. So the next chapter we'll be looking at will be In the Witch's House. It begins, and now of course you want to know what had happened to Edmund. And it runs until "Make ready our sledge," ordered the witch, "and use the harness without bells." I look forward to talking to you about it.